Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're focusing on one single pivotal day, October 7th, 1571.
Lepanto.
Exactly, the Battle of Lepanto. It's this cataclysmic event that still echoes, doesn't it? Even after almost half a millennium, so much drama, so much complexity.
Oh, absolutely. And when we talk about Lepanto, it's more than just another battle in the history books. We're really looking at the last great fight involving the ancient world's kind of warships.
Rowing vessels.
Rowing vessels, exactly. Galleys, imagine it. Over 450 of these ships crammed into a small patch of sea. It was the biggest naval battle since classical antiquity. The scale is just mind-boggling.
Okay, so let's really get into this. Our mission today, I think, needs to go beyond just saying, Christians won. We need to unpack the strategy, the stakes.
Which were enormous.
The unbelievable human story. I mean, tens of thousands of men chained to oars. And then the legacy, it's so profound, almost contradictory in some ways, isn't it? This clash between the Holy League and the Ottomans.
It really is. And what's fascinating, when you look at how people at the time described it, they didn't really see it as a complex naval chess match.
No.
They basically described it as an infantry battle, just happening on floating platforms, these huge wooden ships just smashing into each other, locking together.
Bow to bow.
Yeah, bow to bow, grappling hooks flying. And then it was just hand to hand. Gunpowder, steel, sheer brute force. It gives you this immediate sense of, just how brutal and close quarters it all was.
Okay, part one then. Storm on the horizon. Let's set that stage.
Right.
So how did things get so bad in the Mediterranean? What was the spark, the thing that finally pushed these two huge powers, the Ottomans and Christian Europe, into this massive collision course? It had been building for decades, right?
It had. The immediate context, the flashpoint, was the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War, which kicked off in 1570. Venice, this great maritime republic, had been fighting a losing battle for years against Ottoman expansion in the east.
And Cyprus was the key.
Cyprus was the key. Venice owned it. It was strategically vital, but the Ottomans desperately wanted it. It controlled the sea lanes to Egypt and the Levant.
The Ottomans, under Lala Kara Mustafa Pasha, they'd already taken Nicosia, the capital. But Famagusta, the last Venetian stronghold, held out. Tell us about that siege, because that's where it gets incredibly personal, incredibly brutal.
Famagusta.
Yeah.
That siege was long and just savage. The Venetians, led by Marco Antonio Bragadin, they held out for months against overwhelming odds. Finally, on August 1st, 1571, they surrendered.
But critically, they surrendered based on a promise, right?
A solemn promise. Mustafa Pasha gave his word they'd have safe passage home. It was a formal term of surrender agreed by both sides.
And that promise was just broken.
Completely shattered. It was a horrific betrayal. Mustafa Pasha, he'd lost maybe 50,000 of his own men taking Famagusta. He was furious. He saw the surrendered garrison as, I suppose, revenge.
So he just ignored the terms.
Utterly. Broke his word, imprisoned all the soldiers. And then, in an act that shocked Europe, he had Bragadin tortured and then flayed alive.
Flayed alive?
Yes, and his skin was stuffed with straw, paraded around as a trophy. That single act, that barbarity, it just solidified Christian determination for vengeance. It basically removed any chance of a diplomatic off-ramp. It made a military showdown almost inevitable, a matter of honor.
Which leads us straight to the Holy League. Now, the name sounds unified, like all of Christendom marching together, but the reality was much messier, wasn't it? More desperation and papal politics than actual unity.
Oh, you've hit it exactly. The driving force, the glue holding it together, really was Pope Pius V.
Yeah.
He was absolutely instrumental. He had the moral authority, and he basically dragged these different, often squabbling Catholic states to the table.
Because nobody could face the Ottomans alone.
No single state could. The Ottoman Navy was just too powerful.
Yeah.
So the coalition was necessary, even if it was fragile.
So who actually signed up for this? It sounds like a potentially explosive mix.
It was. You had Venice, obviously, driving the war because of Cyprus, but deeply mistrusted by others, especially Spain. Then the huge power of the Spanish Empire, Philip II's domains, including Naples, Sicily, Sardinia. They brought the money and a lot of the troops.
Okay, who else?
The papal states themselves, Genoa, Venice's rival, the Duchy of Savoy, Tuscany, and critically, the Knights Hospitaller from Malta, who were hardened professional fighters. It was a real pan-European effort, but simmering with old rivalries and suspicions.
And Spain, footing a lot of the bill, but their priorities weren't quite the same as Venice's, were they? That caused friction.
Constant friction. Spain was the biggest financial backer, absolutely. But their main strategic worry was the Western Mediterranean protecting their own coasts and islands from the Barbary pirates, who were, Ottoman allies or vassals.
So they were hesitant to pour everything into a Venetian cause.
Exactly. They were cautious about risking their fleet just to save Venice's island. Spain thought defensively, Venice thought offensively, about revenge for Cyprus. Despite all that, the overall command went to Don John of Austria.
Philip II's young half-brother. Charismatic figure.
Very. And his key deputies were Marcantonio Colonna, representing the Pope, and the Venetian commander Sebastiano Venier, who was old, experienced, and apparently quite fiery.
And this uneasy alliance, this sort of forced unity, it was symbolized by the banner they flew.
Oh, the banner was hugely significant. Part propaganda, part spiritual rallying point. Blessed by the Pope, given to Don John in August 71. It was a blue damask, gold thread showing Christ crucified. But the telling part was the coats of arms, Pius V, Venice, Charles V for Spain, and Don John himself, all linked together with actual chains on the banner.
Literally chained together.
Literally. Symbolizing that this alliance was bound, yes, but maybe only by necessity and faith, not necessarily by friendship.
Okay, let's talk hardware. Ships, manpower, weapons. The numbers alone are staggering, but it sounds like the technological differences were really what decided things.
The sheer scale is hard to comprehend. The Holy League had about 212 ships. Now, that included 109 galleys, the standard oared warship, but crucially, 6 enormous Venetian galleasses.
And the Ottomans. More ships overall.
Numerically superior, yes. Around 278 ships. That was mostly 222 galleys, plus 56 galleas, which were smaller, faster galleys, so more hulls, but...
But those 6 galleasses, let's zero in on them. What made them so different, so revolutionary for the time?
The galleass was kind of a stepping stone to the later ship of the line. Think of it as a huge super galley. It still had oars, but it was much bigger, built stronger to handle rougher seas, and critically, it carried a lot more artillery.
Not just at the front like a normal galley.
Exactly. So standard galley had maybe one big gun in the bow, mostly for clearing the way for boarding. The galleys had guns fore and aft, but also, and this is key along the sides, it could deliver broadsides.
Like a floating fortress, basically. Designed to break up the enemy formation before the real fight even started.
Precisely. They were positioned out in front of the main Christian line. As the Ottomans advanced, these galleasses opened up at close range. The accounts say their heavy fire confused and completely disrupted the Turkish formations before the galleys even clashed. It was a major shift towards firepower deciding battles at sea, moving away from just ramming and boarding.
Beyond the ships, both sides basically put entire armies onto the water. How did the manpower stack up?
Numbers were pretty even overall, maybe 65,000 men for the Holy League, 67,000 for the Ottomans. But the quality of the fighting troops was arguably tilted towards the Christians.
How so?
The League had around 35,000 soldiers, and that included some of the best infantry in Europe, 7,000 elite Spanish regulars, the tercios, 7,000 German mercenaries, there are 6,000 Italians, plus 5,000 professional Venetian soldiers. And we absolutely have to mention the Greeks.
Right, significant Greek involvement.
Huge. Estimates suggest maybe over 25,000 Greeks fought for the Holy League, both as soldiers and critically as oarsmen, more than any other single nationality involved.
And the Ottoman troops, they had the Janissaries, famously fearsome.
They did. About 30,000 soldiers total. But reports at the time suggested the Janissary Corps wasn't at full strength for this campaign. Maybe significantly deficient is the phrase used. Their sailors were very experienced, drawn from all over the Eastern Med. Greeks, Berbers, Syrians, Egyptians. But the real difference, the moral difference, was down below deck.
In the engine room, the oarsmen. This is where it gets grim and where the Holy League had a distinct, maybe moral advantage.
It's fundamental to understanding Lepanto. The Ottomans had around 37,000 oarsmen, and they were, well, the sources say virtually all slaves. Many were captured Christians, chained to their benches. Just imagine the conditions.
Horrific. And the Christian side?
It varied. Some League squadrons used convicts or slaves too. But crucially, the Venetian galleys, a huge part of the fleet, were rowed mainly by free citizens. And they were armed. So they weren't just propulsion, they were extra fighters, highly motivated fighters. That paid off massively during the battle itself.
And finally, firepower. Cannons. A clear Christian edge.
Overwhelmingly so. The Holy League had something like 1,815 guns compared to the Turks' 750. And Ottoman ammunition supplies were reportedly low. Plus, the Christians relied heavily on their arquebusiers and musketeers' matchlock firearms, delivering disciplined volleys. The Ottomans still relied significantly on their traditional composite bowmen, incredibly skilled, yes, but lacking the punch and reload speed of gunpowder weapons in that kind of fight.
Okay, so the fleets are assembled, armed to the teeth. Now they have to get to the fight. They set off from Messina, Sicily, mid-September. Moving over 200 ships must have been a logistical nightmare, but it sounds like the internal politics were almost as dangerous.
The logistics were immense, sure. But the human element, the friction within the Holy League, was incredibly volatile. It was a coalition riddled with distrust. The Spanish and Venetians, especially their commanders, apparently despised each other.
Can you give us an example, something that shows how close to breaking point it was?
There's a famous incident with Sebastiano Venier, the Venetian commander. He later became Doge of Venice, actually. But during the voyage, he apparently enraged Don John, the supreme commander.
How?
He summarily hanged a Spanish soldier for some act of insolence. Now, this wasn't just about discipline, it was about jurisdiction. Venier basically ignored Don John's authority in Spanish military law. Don John was furious, saw it as a direct insult to King Philip II. It nearly fractured the alliance right there.
So Don John was constantly trying to keep this fragile thing together.
Absolutely. Walking an impossible political tightrope.
Given all this internal squabbling, why did they actually decide to fight when they finally met the Ottomans? It sounds like neither side was strategically forced into battle at that exact moment.
Both sides actively chose to engage. The Ottomans, well, they had direct orders from Sultan Selim II, find the Christian fleet and destroy it. For Don John, it was almost political survival. He knew the Holy League was incredibly unstable. If he sighted the enemy and then turned back without fighting, the alliance would almost certainly collapse under the weight of its own internal arguments and blame-mongering. That would hand the Ottomans a huge victory without them even firing a shot. The risk of the League imploding was, ironically, maybe greater than the risk of fighting the Ottomans. He felt he had to fight to keep the expedition together.
Which brings us to the dawn of October 7th, near the Gulf of Patras in Greece. What was the feeling on Don John's flagship La Real when the Ottoman fleet was finally sighted?
Intense. A mix of dread and adrenaline, you have to imagine. The lookout spots the Turkish vanguard at dawn. Accounts describe this huge crescent of ships appearing on the horizon like a vast black scythe sweeping towards them. Don John, despite being young, acted immediately.
No hesitation.
None. Called a council of war, instantly announced they would offer battle. Then, in a really quite brilliant move for morale, he got into a small, fast boat and zipped through the entire fleet.
Visiting ship to ship.
Yes. Exhorting the men, reminding them what they were fighting for: Cyprus, revenge for Famagusta, the thousands of Christian slaves on the Ottoman ships defending Europe itself. Priests administered the sacrament across the fleet, and that huge Holy League banner was hoisted. It was a moment thick with anticipation.
And both commanders addressed the darkest reality of galley warfare, the fate of the oarsmen.
Yes, this is incredibly powerful. Ali Pasha, the Ottoman commander on the Sultana, reportedly addressed his Christian slaves. He said something like, "If I win today, I promise you your freedom. If the day is yours," he apparently added, "then God has given it to you." A grim promise, maybe manipulative, but acknowledging their fate.
And Don John.
Starker. His famous line, shouted across the decks, "There is no paradise for cowards," setting the stakes very clearly.
And crucially, the Christians made a decision about their own slaves and oarsmen just before contact.
A really critical move. They freed the galley slaves on the Christian ships from their chains and gave them weapons.
Instantly adding thousands of motivated fighters.
Exactly. Imagine the psychological impact. One moment you're chained property, the next you're armed, with a chance to fight for your own freedom and maybe strike back at your former captors. It must have provided an enormous surge of fighting power right when it was needed most.
So the fleets are closing. John arrays his forces very deliberately, almost like setting up infantry lines on land. Can you walk us through the Holy League's formation?
It was very structured, 4 main divisions in a long line stretching north to south. On the left, hugging the coast, was Agostino Barbarigo, with 53 galleys and 2 of those vital galleasses.
Okay.
The center, the powerhouse, was led by Don John himself in La Real. That was 62 galleys and 2 more galleasses, with Colonna and Venier close by in support.
Got it.
To the south, further offshore, was the right division under Gianandrea Doria, 53 galleys, 2 galleasses. His role becomes controversial later.
We'll get to that. And behind.
The reserve, absolutely crucial. 38 galleys commanded by Alvar de Bazan, stationed behind the center, ready to plug gaps or exploit openings.
And the Ottomans basically mirrored this setup, ready for a direct clash.
Almost perfectly. Mehmed Sirocco commanded their right, facing Barbarigo near the coast. Ali Pasha led the Ottoman center from the Sultana, directly opposite Don John, and the renowned corsair Ulus Ali commanded their left, offshore, facing Doria. The plan on both sides seemed to be a massive head-on collision.
But then, just before impact comes a moment of pure chance or maybe divine intervention as they saw it, the wind shift.
A huge moment. Around noon, the wind had initially been blowing towards the Ottomans, hindering the Christian approach slightly. Then suddenly it just flips 180 degrees. Now it's favoring the Holy League.
What did that mean tactically?
It allowed the Christian squadrons to get into their perfect positions just before the shooting started. And critically, it helped those forward galleasses maintain their station and open fire with maximum effect as the Ottomans rode into them.
Right back to the galleasses, their impact was immediate.
Absolutely devastating as an opening blow. Those four, positioned ahead of the main lines, just unleashed hell with their side-mounted cannons into the packed Ottoman formations rowing towards them. It didn't just sink ships, it caused chaos, confusion, forced the leading Turkish galleys to break formation even before the main lines crashed together. It meant the Holy League hit an enemy that was already somewhat disordered.
Okay, let's break down the fighting. The first real contact happens on the northern flank near the coast, between Barbarigo and Sirocco.
Right, around noon. This becomes an incredibly vicious, close-in fight almost immediately. Sirocco, the Ottoman commander there, knew the shallow waters well. He tried to use that knowledge to swing around Barbarigo's flank to envelop him against the coast,
Forcing the Christians to react fast.
very fast. The lines basically became entangled. Ships crashed together, grappling hooks flew, and it just turned into this brutal melee. The descriptions talk about an almost continuous platform of hand-to-hand fighting across the decks of the locked ships.
Pure infantry combat, just at sea.
Exactly. Swords, pikes, arquebuses, arrows, everything. The fighting was incredibly intense.
What decided it on that flank?
Well, the cost was horrific on both sides. Both commanders, Barbarigo for the League and Sirocco for the Ottomans, were killed in the fighting on their flagships. But the Christians seemed to gain the upper hand there. Partly due to their heavier infantry, maybe the Venetians' armed oarsmen played a big role too. And interestingly, accounts mention freed Christian slaves from captured Turkish galleys joining the fight with a vengeance, helping to turn the tide on that northern flank. Eventually, the League secured that wing.
While that brutal fight is raging on the north, the main event is kicking off in the center, the clash of the flagships.
This is the absolute heart of the battle. Ali Pasha's flagship, the Sultana, rams head-on into Don John's L'Oreal. The impact must have been tremendous. Sources say the Sultana's bow drove deep into L'Oreal, maybe as far as the fourth rowing bench. They were locked together, an instant floating battlefield.
And this wasn't sailors fighting sailors primarily. This was elite infantry against elite infantry.
Precisely. You had the Spanish tercio soldiers on L'Oreal against the Ottoman janissaries on the Sultana. Hand-to-hand, deck-to-deck. The Spanish, with their pike and shot formations, were devastatingly effective in that kind of close-quarters, disciplined fighting. They could deliver these concentrated volleys of fire before closing with swords and pikes.
But the janissaries were legendary fighters too.
Absolutely relentless with the scimitar. It was a desperate struggle. L'Oreal itself was boarded multiple times, nearly overwhelmed.
What broke the deadlock? How did the Christians turn it around?
It took intervention from the supporting flagships. Marcantonio Colonna, leading the papal galleys, brought his ship alongside the tangled flagships. His troops launched a critical counterattack, boarding the Sultana.
And that was the decisive moment in the center.
That boarding action, combined with reinforcements from other Christian galleys piling in, overwhelmed the defenders on the Sultana. And then came the psychological killer blow.
Ali Pasha's fate.
Ali Pasha himself was killed in the fighting. Accounts differ on exactly how, but he was killed. His head was cut off, apparently against Don John's orders, but it happened. And immediately, the Holy League standard, that big blue banner, was hoisted on the captured Ottoman flagship.
The impact on Ottoman morale must have been devastating.
Instantaneous and catastrophic. Seeing their commander dead and his banner replaced just broke the spirit of the surrounding Turkish galleys. The fight in the center, while pockets of resistance continued, was basically decided within about 2 hours of that flagship duel.
So the north is secured, the center is broken. But down on the southern offshore flank, things get complicated. This involves the Genoese commander, Ginandrea Doria, and actions that even his own side found suspicious.
Doria's maneuvering is probably the most debated aspect of Lepanto. Commanding the Christian right, he sailed way out to the south, opening up a really significant gap between his squadron and Don John's center.
Why? What was his reasoning or alleged reasoning?
His stated reason was tactical. He feared that Ulus Ali, the very skilled Ottoman commander opposite him, was attempting a wide flanking maneuver to get around the Christian line. So Doria sailed south to counter that potential threat.
But his allies didn't buy it.
Not entirely. Doria was Genoese, and Genoa and Venice were bitter rivals. Many Venetians and papal captains suspected he was deliberately holding back, keeping his ships out of the main fight, maybe preserving his squadron in case the battle went badly. The word treachery was definitely muttered on nearby decks.
And Ulus Ali, the Ottoman commander on that flank, he saw this gap Doria created.
Instantly. Ulus Ali was probably the most capable Ottoman admiral there. He saw the huge gap Doria had opened and exploited it brilliantly. He didn't chase Doria south. Instead, he swung his squadron north into that gap, driving straight for the exposed southern edge of the Christian center.
Aiming to roll up the Christian line.
Exactly. He smashed into a group of galleys, including the flagship of the Knights of Malta. For a moment, it looked like he might actually break through, split the Christian fleet, and potentially snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. It was a moment of real crisis.
And this is where the reserve squadron proves its worth.
Absolutely critical. Alvaro de Bazan, commanding the reserve, saw the danger. He acted decisively, committing his fresh galleys to block Ulus Ali's breakthrough.
They plugged the gap.
They plugged the gap just in time. Bazan's intervention stopped Ulus Ali from completely shattering the Christian center. The Corsair fought hard, but facing fresh reserves, he realized he couldn't break through and was forced to disengage. He managed to pull away, though, escaping the destruction and even taking the captured banner of the Knights of Malta with him as a sort of defiant trophy.
So by late afternoon, early evening, the main Ottoman formations are broken. But the fighting isn't quite over. Some pockets of resistance were incredibly stubborn.
Yes, the battle devolved into mopping-up actions. But the Janissaries in particular fought with incredible ferocity, even when their ships were isolated or crippled. They knew capture likely meant death or slavery, so they fought to the last man.
And there's that strange, almost bizarre detail about them running out of weapons.
It's mentioned in some accounts. Apparently, when some Janissaries ran out of arrows, powder, and shot, they started throwing fruit, oranges, and lemons at the Christian soldiers boarding their ships. It led to these weird moments, described as awkward scenes of laughter amidst the absolute horror and carnage. Speaks to the desperation, I suppose.
But the overall result was undeniable. A crushing Christian victory. What was the scale in terms of captured or destroyed ships?
The material loss for the Ottomans was immense. The Holy League captured something like 117 Ottoman galleys and 20 galleots. Another 50 or so were sunk or destroyed. It was a staggering blow to their naval power.
And the human cost. Equally staggering, presumably.
Terrible on both sides, reflecting the intensity of the close-quarters fighting. Christian losses were estimated between 7,500 and maybe 10,000 killed. Many senior commanders were among them. Ottoman losses were far higher. Estimates range from 20,000 to perhaps 25,000 killed.
And beyond the casualties, the most immediate human outcome, the liberated slaves.
This was perhaps the most powerful symbol of the victory, certainly in moral terms. Around 15,000 Christian galley slaves were freed from the captured Ottoman ships. Imagine the scenes on the Christian decks as these men were unchained. It wasn't just a number. It was this huge, tangible act of liberation that resonated deeply across all of Christian Europe.
So the battle is won. The scale of the victory is clear. Back in Constantinople, the news must have landed like a thunderclap. The Ottomans hadn't suffered a major naval defeat like this in over a century, right?
Not since the 15th century. The shock, especially among the Ottoman ruling class, must have been profound. Their whole image was built on this idea of military invincibility, of constant expansion. Lepanto wasn't just losing ships, it dented that mystique.
Paul K. Davis, the historian, puts it well. He says Lepanto was more than a military victory. Lepanto was a moral one.
That captures it perfectly. It damaged the aura of Ottoman power, showed they could be beaten decisively at sea. And for Christian Europe, which had felt increasingly threatened since the fall of Constantinople, it was a massive psychological boost. It gave them hope.
Yet, despite this huge tactical win, this huge moral win, it didn't immediately translate into major strategic gains for the Holy League, did it?
That's the great paradox of Lepanto, isn't it? Tactically, it was overwhelming. Strategically, in the short term, surprisingly little changed on the map. The battle essentially confirmed the existing situation. The Eastern Mediterranean remained largely Ottoman-controlled, the West largely Spanish and Italian-controlled.
So the Holy League didn't manage to immediately take back territory lost before the battle, like Cyprus.
No, that's the key point. Despite the immense effort and sacrifice, they failed to capitalize immediately. Cyprus, the very reason the war started, remained firmly in Ottoman hands.
Why couldn't they capitalize? Part of the answer seems to be the sheer resilience of the Ottoman Empire. They bounced back incredibly quickly.
Their recovery was astonishing. It really demonstrated the resources and organizational power of the empire. Within just 6 months of Lepanto, by the spring of 1572, the Ottoman shipyards were working flat out. They launched over 150 new galleys, built 8 galleasses copying the Venetian design, and had around 250 ships ready in total.
They basically replaced the entire fleet in half a year.
Pretty much. An incredible feat. By 1572, they had a huge new fleet back in the eastern Mediterranean, effectively daring the Holy League to come out and fight again. It showed a capacity to absorb a massive material loss that the Christian coalition just couldn't match.
And this incredible recovery is summed up in that famous, almost arrogant quote from the Ottoman Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, right, talking to the Venetian ambassador.
Yes, it's one of the great quotes of geopolitical history. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha basically dismissed the significance of Lepanto. He told the Venetian envoy something like, "In taking Cyprus from you, we have cut off one of your arms. In defeating our fleet, you have only shaved our beard."
Ouch!
He continued, "A shorn beard will grow back all the stronger for the razor." His point was brutal but clear. Venice's loss of Cyprus was permanent, irreplaceable. The Ottoman loss of ships, however painful, was temporary. They had the resources, the timber, the manpower, the shipyards to rebuild.
It really highlights the asymmetry, doesn't it? Venice lost an essential limb. The Ottomans just needed a shave.
Exactly. It shows the difference between a maritime republic, however wealthy, and a vast land-based empire controlling immense resources. The Ottomans could absorb shocks that would cripple smaller states.
So, while the Ottomans are busy rebuilding ships, the Holy League starts to fray. Political reality bites. But the symbolic victory of Lepanto, the religious and cultural impact, that was immediate and massive. It became myth almost overnight.
Absolutely. It was instantly framed as a divine victory. The Pope, the commanders, everyone credited the win not just to guns and soldiers, but to the intervention of the Virgin Mary, specifically through praying the Rosary, which Pope Pius V had heavily promoted.
Leading to a new feast day.
Yes, Pius V established the Feast of Our Lady of Victory on October 7th. It's still celebrated today in the Catholic Church, though now usually as the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. Lepanto became deeply embedded in Catholic identity and piety.
And politically, rulers like Philip II of Spain used this religious framing.
Oh, definitely. For Philip II, Lepanto was proof of his status as the most Catholic king, God's chosen defender of Christendom against Islam. It massively boosted his prestige and solidified his image across Europe.
And the artists went into overdrive. It sounds like there was an explosion of commemorative art and literature.
An incredible outpouring. Just in Italy, apparently over 200 collections of poems and sonnets about Lepanto were printed in the first couple of years after the battle. You get major paintings commissioned. Titian painted Philip II presenting his infant son to the Virgin Mary in thanks for the victory. Veronese painted his famous allegory of the Battle of Lepanto, showing Venice being blessed.
So it was immediately cemented in public consciousness.
Yes, through paintings, poems, sculptures. They even put up a statue of Don John in Messina just a year later, in 1572. The victory needed to be seen, celebrated, remembered.
And we can't talk about the legacy without mentioning Miguel de Cervantes. He actually fought there.
He did. The future author of Don Quixote was a soldier on a galley at Lepanto. He fought bravely, was wounded several times, took 2 shots in the chest, and another that permanently maimed his left hand. He was immensely proud of having been there, calling it the most noble and memorable occasion that past centuries have seen. The experience undoubtedly shaped him and his later work.
And much later, G.K. Chesterton wrote that famous poem, Lepanto, capturing that sense of epic, almost apocalyptic struggle.
Right. Chesterton's poem really taps into that mythological clash of civilizations narrative that grew up around the battle.
So we come back to that big question. Was Lepanto truly a turning point, or just a spectacular but ultimately temporary setback for the Ottomans, as Sokollu suggested?
Looking back, the verdict has to be a massive tactical win for the League, but followed by strategic failure. They just couldn't hold the alliance together to exploit the victory.
Why did it unravel so quickly?
Several reasons. Pope Pius V, the driving force, died in 1572. The old rivalries, especially between Spain and Venice, flared up again almost immediately. Don John, facing the rebuilt Ottoman fleet in 1572, was cautious, perhaps overly so, and avoided another major battle, fearing heavy losses or stalemate. The momentum was lost.
And this forced Venice's hand. They were exposed, exhausted, and worried about their other territories.
Exactly. Venice feared losing more ground in the Adriatic, their crucial trade routes. They felt isolated. So, despite being on the winning side at Lepanto, they decided to cut their losses and negotiate a separate peace with the Ottomans.
Undermining the whole point of the Holy League.
Completely. They went behind their allies' backs.
And the peace treaty they signed in 1573 really underlines the strategic failure, doesn't it?
It's quite stark. The terms were harsh for Venice. They formally had to cede Cyprus, the original cause of the war, to the Ottomans. And they had to pay a huge war indemnity, 300,000 ducats.
Wow, so they won the battle but lost the war, essentially.
In terms of Cyprus, yes. The Holy League dissolved, and the Ottomans immediately pressed their advantage elsewhere. They retook Tunis from the Spanish in 1574. By 1576, they dominated almost the entire southern coast of the Mediterranean again, except for a few isolated Spanish forts.
Okay, so if Lepanto didn't immediately change the map, maybe its real long-term significance lies elsewhere, perhaps in confirming a shift in naval power that was already starting.
I think that's a much better way to look at it. The real turning point in Mediterranean naval dominance wasn't Lepanto itself, but what happened after 1580 or so. It was about technology and economics. The Ottoman Empire gradually found it harder and harder to compete with the accelerating pace of European naval innovation, especially coming out of the Atlantic nations.
You're talking about the shift away from galleys altogether, towards sailing ships.
Exactly. The future wasn't the galley, even the mighty galleys. It was the galleon, a ship designed purely for sail, carrying heavy artillery and broadsides. And new tactics emerged to use these ships, like the line of battle, which focused on maneuver and massed cannon fire.
So Lepanto was the peak, the glorious climax of galley warfare, but that whole style of fighting was already becoming obsolete.
Precisely. Galleys just couldn't stand up to a well-handled fleet of galleons in open water over a prolonged fight. The firepower difference was too great.
Is there a specific battle that demonstrates this shift clearly, showing the galley's vulnerability just a few decades later?
Yes. There is a battle often called the Little Lepanto, the Battle of Cape Gelidonia in 1616. It's a fascinating comparison. A small squadron of just 6 Spanish galleons encountered a large Ottoman fleet of 55 galleys.
6 against 55? Sounds like a mismatch.
You'd think so, based on Lepanto's numbers. But the galleons, using their superior range and firepower, just systematically battered the Ottoman galleys from a distance. The galleys couldn't effectively close and board. The Spanish won decisively. It proved that the age of oar and ram was over, the age of sail and cannon had truly arrived. The technology that dominated at Lepanto was already history just 45 years later.
So when we look back at Lepanto, it's this incredible paradox. A stunning, bloody, decisive victory, the absolute zenith of galley warfare. But it brought minimal immediate strategic change, and the very weapons and methods used were already on the verge of obsolescence. Yet its moral and psychological impact was undeniable, reshaping how Europe saw the Ottomans and itself.
It really was the swan song of the ancient warship, wasn't it? The end of a line stretching back through Rome all the way to the Greek trireme. Which leaves us with a fascinating thought, maybe for you listening. Think about other great decisive battles in history. How many of them, though utterly victorious at the time, also marked the end of the very era, the very technology that won them? Lepanto feels like a battle won at the precise moment its way of war was dying.
A powerful thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex currents of Lepanto.